Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to talk about the rise of Andrew Jackson, continuing on from the controversy after the election of 1824. So, here are your objectives. Pause and make sure that you fully understand them, because again, we'll be back to them at the end. And without further ado, let's try to tell the comprehensive and complicated story of the rise of Andrew Jackson. So, Andrew Jackson rose to power in the election of 1828, which in a number of ways was a rematch of the election of 1824. But in those 4 years, the controversy over the whole corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams led the electoral landscape of American society to drastically change. So, in some ways, a rematch, but in other ways, a completely different affair. So, what was different in 1828? Well, a bunch of different things. The first major difference is that the vote had been substantially expanded. As you probably remember from the early days of the Republic, only men with property could vote, but that had been starting to drastically change across different areas of the country. You can see that originally almost all states had some level of property requirements, but over time, more and more states, specifically states in the West, have been dropping them. And a major political change that was kicked off by an attempt by House and Senate members to raise their salaries led this to greatly expand in the 1820s. House and Senate members were paid a tiny pittance. And so one goal, so there was this movement to try to improve the salaries of representatives, which hadn't changed in the past 30 years. But it's incredibly unpopular for senators specifically, and representatives too, honestly, for all elected officials to vote to pay themselves more money. And so this led to a massive backlash, bringing in a whole new wave of representatives who were much more populist and much more willing to expand suffrage. So, expanded suffrage meant that the way in which elections were run and the way in which campaigns were run was going to change dramatically. Specifically, individual popularity and the cult of personality became incredibly important. This is the idea of the quote American hero or common man that was embodied by Andrew Jackson that really remade the way elections were created. Where as opposed to George Washington standing for election based on his august reputation, you've got Andrew Jackson, who's a man of the people and a hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And he had a nickname. He was called Old Hickory because he was tough as an old hickory stick. So you can relate to him because he's got a nickname, just like you've got a nickname. Jackson also had this history, this mythologized history, going back to the Revolutionary War when he was a messenger boy for the rebellion. He refused to shine a British officer's shoes, and the British officer slashed at him with a sword, and he got cut on the hand. And so this was played up as Andrew Jackson standing up even as a kid to tyranny and all that fun stuff. He was also an avid dueler. Jackson had won a lot of duels, and we had talked previously why duels were important. But Jackson had a very specific way of winning duels. Jackson had these sort of piercing, very intense eyes. And so rather than trying to fire when the duel started, he would instead just stare at the other person. And so in his most famous duel, Jackson just glared at the guy as the guy pulled his gun and carefully aimed and fired. And Jackson didn't respond at all, then pulled up his gun and shot and killed his opponent. Obviously, everyone had thought that his opponent had missed, but afterwards, it was revealed that actually he had hit Jackson, in the sort of shoulder area, and Jackson just hadn't moved or responded at all. And so all of this helps build Andrew Jackson's character and allows him to become incredibly popular. The election of 1828 also is one of the first elections in which they go incredibly negative. And it's not the first election because 1800 was a really negative election, but 1828 sets a new bar as far as what negative is. For example, they referred to Jackson as a jackass. Here we see here as Jackson as a jackass. And Jackson actually thought that tried to take this and turn it into a compliment, and therefore took the donkey as his symbol of the new Democratic Party, saying that it was a loyal and noble beast. So that's the origin of the Democratic donkey, was an attempt to paint Jackson as a jackass. The John Quincy Adams campaign also emphasized the number of people Jackson had killed, both in duels and in his Creek campaigns, and then, of course, in the War of 1812, and tried to paint Jackson as this ridiculous barbarian. Here Jackson is hanging John Quincy Adams, just like he hung those British smugglers when he invaded Florida. The other thing that the Adams campaign went after was Jackson's wife, which really pissed off Andrew Jackson because Rachel Jackson had actually been married to someone else and had believed that she was divorced, but apparently the paperwork was never filed. So when she married Andrew Jackson, she was actually married to someone else, making her, gasp, a bigamist. So the John Quincy Adams campaign hit her on that, which Jackson was outraged by because he felt like it was unfairly attacking his wife's honor. But in the 1800s, this was a relatively damning charge, and so all of this did some damage to Andrew Jackson. Jackson's campaign struck back, claiming that Adams was an out of touch aristocrat who was using federal money to buy a pool table for the White House, and that when he was an ambassador to Russia, he had whored out one of his assistants to the Russian czar. Most of this was not true, of course. The pool table was true, but most of the rest of it wasn't true. But it sort of captured the ethos of the election with Jackson as the rough and tumble, old hickory man of the people, whereas Adams was an effete aristocrat. And so my favorite slogan is this one, which does probably emphasize the two strengths of the candidates, but I think it maybe misrepresents the skills that might be needed to be an effective president. But it didn't matter. Jackson wins in a landslide, mostly because of his victories in the South and the West, demonstrating that this new Jackson-Calhoun Southwest alliance was stronger than the Clay-Adams Northwest alliance. And so we see a remaking of electoral politics, ushering in the age of Jackson. So, what can we say about Andrew Jackson? Man, there's a lot. He was, of course, known as the people's president because he was just a common man of the people, being a wealthy slave trader living in Tennessee, just like the average person was. But he did do all these things to ingratiate himself to the common people. For example, he opened up his inauguration to everybody, and so there was a massive flood of people into the White House to celebrate his inauguration. They bought a ludicrously big wheel of cheese that people would just cut pieces off in order to eat as part of this inaugural feast. And apparently they ground so much cheese into the White House upholstery that it just stunk for months, basically confirming all of Jackson's critics' feelings about him. And apparently, in order to get all these people out, they had to move the punch bowls outside to the White House lawn and then lock the doors because the crowds were destroying the White House to a massive extent. Jackson's early term was actually mired in a massive political scandal, and we're not going to go into the details of the salacious petticoat affair. You can look it up if you're interested, but it's important because it led to, one, Jackson to turn on John C. Calhoun and that political alliance to break down. And so he turned away from Calhoun and started to rely more on Martin Van Buren, his Secretary of State. And it's also important because Jackson fired his whole cabinet, and this basically detached him from all his political advisors, allowing him to do more or less whatever he wanted, which, to be honest, he's Andrew Jackson. That's probably what he would have done anyway. So, petticoat affair changed some facts, changed the political landscape, and Jackson changed the form or the substance of the federal government through what's called the spoils system. Jackson called it rotation in office. But the spoils system is the idea that an incoming president should replace public officials, bureaucrats, department heads, things like that, with their own people. And so whereas almost every president previous to Jackson who came to power had left most of the existing government officials in place, Jackson fired just about everyone and replaced them with his own supporters. This would be a way to reward supporters going forward, and it became a very entrenched system that had some benefits because, of course, when you're a president, you want to have your bureaucrats doing things to support your agenda. But having the entire federal government turn over every couple of years means you've got a lot of very inexperienced people in these positions who owe their political lives to the president, and so that causes some theoretical problems. It also, of course, led to a whole host of people descending on Washington trying to get these government jobs, which is going to lead to some problems for Andrew Jackson. So Jackson's individual power increases because, of course, he can dangle all of these jobs for people. In this political cartoon, Jackson is literally Satan dangling government positions for all these office seekers. Second piece of legislation that Jackson got passed was the Indian Removal Act, which is obviously a really problematic one. So, the Indian Removal Act, or support to the Indian Removal Act, was increased by what's called Black Hawk's War, which you read a little bit of Black Hawk for your documents today. Black Hawk invaded or launched an invasion across the Mississippi River, basically to protest loss of Native American land. He won a series of battles before he was finally defeated and captured up in what is today Wisconsin. But what Black Hawk's War convinced people is that Native Americans were dangerous and they needed to be removed from any territory that was going to be quote unquote civilized. So that leads us to the 5 civilized tribes who had been living somewhat in the southeast of the United States since since before the Revolutionary War. These tribes had embraced farming. A lot of them had embraced Christianity. A lot of them had created their own democratic forms of government and had basically followed Jefferson's plan of assimilation. But Jackson decided that we wanted that land for cotton. And so these tribes, in addition to a couple tribes in the Northwest, were ordered removed from their land. They were forced to sell that land to the federal government and to travel west of the Mississippi River to territory that was set aside for them that they were then guaranteed that they would be able to keep forever. For the most part, a couple of the Native American tribes went along with this, but specifically the Cherokee Nation filed a series of Supreme Court cases protesting their removal, arguing that it was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court ruled for the Cherokee, arguing that yes, the Indian Removal Act was unconstitutional. Jackson then famously responded that he would not enforce the Supreme Court decision and sent in federal troops to force the Cherokees to go along what was called the Trail of Tears, which was a forced march through the winter of 1837, which led to the deaths of thousands of Cherokee. Here we see a depiction of the Cherokee guarded by federal soldiers being forced to march out to their new home in Oklahoma. And here we see a political cartoon criticizing that, the inhumaneness of the whole movement. So, Indian Removal Act, one of the most problematic pieces of Jackson's first term. We also saw Nat Turner's rebellion, which brings us back to the issue of slavery, which we need to remember is always sitting there, sometimes breaching the surface of the narrative, other times not, but an entrenched part of American society. Nat Turner's rebellion was in 1831 in Virginia, and Nat Turner and a group of other slaves. Nat Turner was an educated and relatively well-read slave, and was able to raise a group of enslaved people, and they went from plantation to plantation, freeing slaves and killing the slave owners. And so this was every Southerner's worst nightmare, was that a group of organized enslaved people would rise up and kill them, because in a lot of areas, enslaved people outnumbered the slave owners. And so this rebellion had a couple different effects. One, having watched the Haitian Revolution, the South was terrified of future slave uprisings, and so they passed even stricter laws restricting the rights of enslaved people. And it really started galvanizing the lines between abolitionists who wanted slavery removed and Southerners who started to argue in even more drastic terms that slavery was somehow a positive institution that helped African Americans, despite the rebellions and the running away and the maroon communities and the inhumaneness of the entire system. And so it further galvanized these lines, and it's eventually going to lead to the gag order, where this Congress bans the discussion of slavery in the House of Representatives because it was getting so heated. So we're just going to pretend it's not a thing, I guess. Ugh. Anyway, this is only the first half of Jackson's action-filled 2 terms, and we'll come back and try to deal with the rest of it next time. So hopefully you can adequately answer these questions, and we'll be back to tell the rest of the story of Andrew Jackson and how American society was remade.